The signal did not arrive with noise. No alarm screamed across the galaxy. No fleets mobilized. No emergency protocols activated. It simply appeared, quietly, simultaneously, and with absolute authority, on every diplomatic channel, every trade network, every civil interface connected to the interstellar grid. Humanity had been removed. Not sanctioned. Not suspended. Removed. No explanation beyond a single, sterile line. Systemic dependency risk exceeds acceptable thresholds. For a moment, just a moment, the galaxy waited. Because this was humanity. The same species that had rewritten trade algorithms in a single decade, stabilized collapsing economies without claiming ownership, and inserted itself so deeply into the machinery of civilization that most systems no longer remembered how they had functioned before. This was not a species you removed quietly. This was a species that responded. But nothing came. No protests flooded the channels. No emergency summits demanded reconsideration. No human fleets repositioned at contested borders. Their diplomatic relays remained open, their communication nodes active, but silent. Not a word. At first, it was interpreted as shock. Then restraint. Then strategy. But 12 hours passed. Then 24. Then 3 full cycles. Still nothing. It unsettled people in ways open conflict never had. Because conflict could be measured. It had direction. It had intent. This felt like absence with purpose. The first anomaly was so small it barely registered. A mid-tier logistics hub in a peripheral system reported a minor delay in routing optimization. Not failure, just inefficiency. A deviation of 0.7%. The kind of fluctuation that happened thousands of times a day across a network this large. It was logged. Categorized. Ignored. Then another. And another. Different sectors. Different systems. No pattern that could be immediately traced, only a subtle, creeping friction where there had once been seamless flow. Still, no one connected it to the silence. Because the systems were still running. Ships still moved. Cargo still arrived. Communications still flowed. Nothing had broken. But something had changed. A junior systems observer on an outer ring station noticed it first, though she couldn't explain why it bothered her. She wasn't looking for anomalies. She wasn't even monitoring human infrastructure directly. Her assignment was routine throughput verification. Numbers, patterns, expected ranges. And yet, something about the data felt incomplete. Not wrong. Too right. Every human-designed system was shutting down its adaptive processes with perfect compliance. No resistance. No residual errors. No corrupted pathways. Just clean disengagement. Like a machine that had decided, long before this moment, exactly how it would stop. She replayed the logs 3 times. Then 5. Then 10. Each time, the same quiet precision stared back at her. Not failure. Not removal. Execution. She sat there, staring at the cascading lines of data, and felt a slow, deliberate realization begin to form. One that didn't fit into any official report or acceptable conclusion. Humans hadn't reacted. Because this looked like something they had already prepared for. And if that was true, then the question wasn't why humanity was silent. The question was what they had already set in motion before anyone thought to remove them. By the 4th cycle, the silence had become a topic of discussion. Not publicly, not in official chambers or recorded proceedings, but in the quieter corridors where uncertainty was allowed to exist without consequence. The absence of a human response had begun to weigh on people in a way that defied logic. It wasn't just that humanity had said nothing. It was that they continued to do nothing. No reconfiguration of fleets. No sudden economic shifts. No surge in independent activity. Their systems, where still permitted to operate during the transition window, followed every directive with flawless compliance. Too flawless. The Council released a statement on the 6th cycle, reassuring all member species that transitional instability was expected. Human contributions, while historically significant, were categorized as non-critical redundancies within a diversified infrastructure model. Replacement protocols had already been distributed. Adjustments were underway. Everything was under control. And for a while, it seemed true. Trade lanes remained open, though slightly slower. Arbitration systems continued processing disputes, though with minor delays. Medical supply chains functioned, though response times stretched just enough to be noticed, but not enough to trigger alarm. Nothing was failing. But nothing was as efficient as it had been. The difference was subtle, almost psychological at first. Pilots reported needing to make more manual corrections during transit. Dispatch coordinators found themselves double-checking routing outputs that had once been trusted without question. Analysts began adding buffer margins into projections where none had been needed before. Tiny adjustments. Individually meaningless. Collectively, something else. The junior observer, Lena Erie, filed her first report on the 8th cycle. She didn't frame it as a crisis. She didn't even label it as an anomaly. She simply documented what she was seeing, a pattern of micro-degradations across systems previously optimized by human-designed frameworks. Her report was precise, cautious, and buried under 17 layers of routine data submissions. It should have disappeared. Instead, it was flagged. Not for urgency, for inconsistency. A senior reviewer appended a note: correlation insufficient. Likely variance within acceptable thresholds. The report was archived. Lena didn't stop. Because the numbers kept shifting. Not randomly. Not chaotically. Deliberately. That was the part she couldn't explain, and the part she couldn't ignore. Each system degradation followed a similar curve, gradual, controlled, never exceeding failure thresholds, but always trending downward. It was as if something was allowing the system to weaken, but refusing to let it break. She began cross-referencing. Trade routes. Medical relays. Communication nodes. Navigation assists. The connections weren't obvious until she stopped looking for direct links and started mapping timing instead. That's when it appeared. Not a network. A rhythm. The delays weren't happening everywhere at once. They were moving, like a wave passing through the infrastructure, touching one system, then another, never overlapping, never compounding into a visible crisis. Just enough disruption to force attention. Not enough to trigger intervention. Lena leaned back from her terminal, eyes fixed on the pattern she had isolated, and felt something cold settle into place. This wasn't decay. Decay was messy. This was controlled. She pulled historical logs from before the removal order, searching for baseline comparisons. What she found didn't make sense at first. The systems had always been efficient, remarkably so, but now she could see the layers beneath that efficiency. Adaptive layers. Human layers. Thousands of micro-adjustments running in parallel, constantly correcting, optimizing, compensating for variables no one else had even known existed. And now, those layers were gone. Not damaged. Not corrupted. Gone. Removed so cleanly it was as if they had never been there at all. Except the systems were still running on the assumption that they existed. Which meant something impossible had just become unavoidable. The galaxy hadn't removed humanity from its systems. Humanity had removed itself. Lena stared at the data, her thoughts racing ahead of what she could prove, what she could even safely consider. Because if the systems were degrading this precisely, if the pattern was this controlled, then someone, somewhere, was still managing the pace of the decline. And that meant humanity wasn't absent. It was watching. The next data spike hit 12 seconds later. And this time, it didn't fit the pattern. The spike should not have existed. Lena replayed the data stream again, isolating the anomaly down to its raw inputs, stripping away predictive overlays and smoothing algorithms until only the unprocessed signal remained. It was sharp, precise, and completely out of rhythm with everything she had mapped so far. For 9 cycles, the degradation had behaved like a controlled tide, predictable, measured, almost considerate. It never overwhelmed a system. Never triggered cascading failures. It moved with intent, but also restraint. This was different. A relay node in the outer Kashari corridor had surged to peak capacity for exactly 4 seconds, far beyond its operational baseline, before stabilizing as if nothing had happened. No error logs. No alerts. No secondary impact. It was as if something had briefly overridden the system. Then let go. Lena's fingers hovered over her console, hesitation threading through her focus for the first time since she had begun tracking the pattern. Because this wasn't degradation anymore. This was interaction. She ran a cross-check against every system that had experienced the controlled slowdown. The results came back faster than she expected, and when they did, her breath caught, not from surprise, but from confirmation. Every single system touched by the decline had one thing in common. They had all once been stabilized by human adaptive frameworks. That alone wasn't new. What was new was the absence of randomness. If these systems were truly degrading naturally after losing human optimization, the failures should have been chaotic, uneven, unpredictable. Instead, they were synchronized without overlapping, isolated without disconnecting, guided without being seen. Lena leaned forward, zooming in on the relay spike again. 4 seconds. That was all it had taken. 4 seconds to push a node beyond safe limits without causing damage. It wasn't a failure. It was a test. The realization didn't come all at once. It assembled itself piece by piece, each fragment locking into place with quiet inevitability. The slow degradation wasn't the problem. It was the setup. Someone, was mapping the system. Learning how it behaved without human correction. Measuring how far it could be pushed before it broke. And now, it had started pushing. Lena's access level wasn't high enough to pull full network diagnostics, but she didn't need them anymore. The pattern she had been tracking, the wave of inefficiencies, the precision of the shutdowns, the absence of residual code, it all pointed to a single conclusion she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Humanity hadn't just stepped away. It had left behind control points. Not physical nodes. Not visible infrastructure. Something deeper. Embedded. Dormant. Waiting. Her screen flickered as a new data stream populated, another spike, this time in a completely different sector. Shorter. Sharper. Gone before the monitoring system could classify it. Then another. And another. No longer a wave. Now, pulses. Testing different regions. Different loads. Different thresholds. Lena felt the shift in her chest before she fully understood it. The careful restraint that had defined the past cycles was slipping. Not gone, but changing. Escalating. She opened a secure channel and began compiling everything she had, every log, every pattern, every correlation. This was no longer something she could quietly archive or cautiously report. This was movement. Intentional movement. But even as she assembled the data, something else began to surface, something buried deeper than the system fluctuations themselves. A gap. Not in performance. In access. Certain sectors, small, scattered, mostly ignored by central oversight, weren't appearing in the degradation logs at all. No slowdowns. No spikes. No irregularities of any kind. They were stable. Perfectly stable. Lena isolated those sectors, mapping them against trade activity, communication throughput, and infrastructure dependencies. At first, it looked like noise, insignificant systems, low traffic, minimal strategic value. But when she overlaid the timing data, the pulses, the slowdowns, the controlled inefficiencies, something emerged that made her pulse quicken. The unstable regions surrounded them. Not randomly. Deliberately. Like a system being shaped around fixed points. Safe zones. She pulled deeper records, old registries, outdated classifications, archived infrastructure notes, and found something that shouldn't have mattered. Human involvement. Minimal. Peripheral. Almost invisible. But present. Every stable sector had once hosted minor human installations, small-scale logistics hubs, experimental routing nodes, auxiliary support systems that had never been fully integrated into council infrastructure. They had been dismissed as insignificant. Left alone. Forgotten. Until now. Lena stared at the map forming on her screen, a scattered pattern of stability encircled by controlled instability, and felt the weight of what she was seeing settle into something far more dangerous than uncertainty. This wasn't a failing system. It was a restructuring. Not collapse. Transition. The pulses intensified. 3 spikes in under a minute. Different sectors. Different scales. All precise. All deliberate. Lena's report finished compiling, but she didn't send it. Not yet. Because a new question had just replaced all the others, pushing everything else aside with quiet, terrifying clarity. If humanity was still shaping the system, if those stable zones were intentional, then they weren't just testing the galaxy's infrastructure. They were building something inside it. And whatever it wasn't ready to be seen yet. By the 12th cycle, the word instability was no longer sufficient. It had become something else, something harder to categorize, harder to contain. Not because systems were collapsing outright, but because they were failing in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or transitional error. A freight convoy in the inner trade lanes lost synchronization with its routing network for 17 seconds, just long enough to drift into a restricted corridor and trigger an automated defense response. No casualties, no permanent damage, but the incident forced a temporary shutdown of 3 adjacent lanes, delaying thousands of shipments across 4 sectors. It was the first time the disruption had crossed into visible consequence. And it didn't stop there. Medical distribution chains began reporting inconsistencies, not shortages, not failures, but timing mismatches. Deliveries arrived hours earlier than scheduled in one system, and hours late in another, disrupting carefully balanced treatment cycles that relied on precision. Communication relays developed micro-latencies that caused translation nodes to misalign context in high-level negotiations. Not enough to cause breakdowns, but enough to introduce hesitation, doubt, misinterpretation. The galaxy was still functioning, but it was no longer flowing. It was catching, pausing, correcting itself constantly, like a system that had lost its internal rhythm and was struggling to compensate in real time. And beneath it all, the pulses continued. Faster now. More frequent. Less careful. Lena watched them spread across her display, each one a controlled disruption, each one testing a different layer of the infrastructure. She had stopped trying to convince herself they were unrelated. The pattern was too precise, too intentional. This was no longer observation. This was progression. Her report, now expanded beyond her original findings, had finally reached someone who mattered. She knew that because she had been reassigned. Not promoted. Not acknowledged. Moved. Her new access clearance came without explanation, along with a directive that was as vague as it was unmistakable: continue analysis. Prioritize pattern correlation. Which meant someone had seen what she saw. Or worse, they had already suspected it. The deeper systems she now had access to confirmed her growing fear. The stable zones weren't just unaffected regions. They were insulated. Their data traffic followed different pathways, subtle deviations in routing that bypassed central optimization hubs entirely. Their logistics chains operated with independent timing structures, unaffected by the broader network fluctuations. And most critically, their systems were improving. Not dramatically. Not enough to draw attention on their own. But while the rest of the galaxy struggled with increasing inefficiencies, these isolated sectors were becoming faster, cleaner, more precise. Lena zoomed in on one of them, a minor outpost system with no strategic importance, barely worth cataloging under normal circumstances. Its trade throughput had increased by 12% in the last 3 cycles. Its error rate had dropped to near zero. Its routing predictions were outperforming central systems by a measurable margin. It made no sense. Unless it wasn't part of the same system anymore. The realization came with a sharp clarity that left no room for doubt. These weren't just safe zones. They were alternatives. Something separate. Something being built quietly alongside the failing infrastructure of the Council. And the pulses, the controlled disruptions, they weren't random tests. They were shaping pressure. Forcing the galaxy to adapt. Or fail. A priority alert flashed across her console, pulling her attention away from the map. A major relay junction in a mid-core sector had just gone offline. Not degraded. Not delayed. Offline. For 6 seconds. That was all it took. 6 seconds to disrupt navigation across 3 major trade routes, triggering emergency rerouting protocols that cascaded through dozens of systems. Ships stalled. Cargo queues backed up. Communication lag spiked across entire regions. Then the relay came back. Perfectly functional. No damage. No explanation. The system logs showed no failure. No intrusion. No cause. It had simply stopped. And started again. Lena's pulse quickened as she cross-referenced the event with her stability map. The affected routes, all of them, had one thing in common. They bordered the stable zones. She stared at the connection, the pattern now too obvious to ignore, and felt the scale of it settle in fully for the first time. This wasn't random escalation. This was containment. The unstable regions were being pushed outward. The stable ones, protected. Expanding. Slowly. Deliberately. As if something was redrawing the boundaries of the entire network from the inside out. A secure transmission request appeared on her screen. Priority clearance beyond anything she had seen before. She hesitated for only a second before accepting. The feed resolved into a single figure, an older official, composed but unmistakably tense. "We've reviewed your analysis," he said without preamble. "You're going to tell me exactly what you think is happening." Lena held his gaze for a moment, weighing the risk of saying it out loud. Because once it was spoken, it couldn't be contained. "They're not degrading the system," she said finally, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. "They're replacing it." Silence followed. Not disbelief. Recognition. The official exhaled slowly. "With what?" Lena glanced back at her map, the expanding pockets of stability, the shifting flow of data, the invisible structure forming beneath everything the Council still believed it controlled. "That's the problem," she said. "We don't know where it ends." Another alert triggered. Then another. Multiple sectors this time. Simultaneous disruptions. Brief, precise, controlled. Not failures. Signals. Lena's screen filled with cascading updates, each one reinforcing what she already understood. This wasn't the beginning of a collapse. It was the midpoint of a transition. And whatever humanity was building, it was almost ready to be seen. The first official request was denied before it was even sent. Not by policy. Not by vote. By hesitation. The council chamber had not felt this uncertain in decades. Representatives spoke in careful tones, circling the same conclusion without ever stating it directly. Every projection, every contingency model, every recovery simulation led to the same quiet inevitability. They needed access. Not to human systems. The assumption that those still existed in any recognizable form had already begun to fracture, but to whatever had replaced them. And that was the problem. No one knew how to ask for something that technically didn't exist. Because the more Lena's analysis spread through internal channels, the clearer the picture became. The stable zones weren't anomalies. They weren't isolated improvements. They were connected. Not visibly. Not through registered pathways or traceable infrastructure. But functionally. Perfectly. The data proved it. Resources moved between them without passing through central routing hubs. Communications flowed with zero latency across distances that should have required multiple relay points. Trade synchronization occurred without arbitration delays, without conflict resolution cycles, without any of the bureaucratic friction that defined council systems. It was impossible. Unless it wasn't using the same rules. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A minor shipping consortium operating along the outer corridors, too small to matter, too distant to monitor closely, filed a routine traffic update. Buried in its logs was a registry signature that hadn't appeared in over 20 years. Human origin. Not legacy. Active. That single detail triggered a cascade of investigations, each one peeling back another layer of something that had been deliberately hidden in plain sight. Stations that had quietly expanded over the last decade. Depots that had upgraded their infrastructure without requesting council support. Transit hubs that operated just outside official trade lanes, serving routes no one had considered economically viable. Individually, they had been ignored. Together, they formed a pattern. Lena stood in the central analysis chamber as the full map assembled for the first time. It stretched across the outer systems, threading through neglected regions, connecting worlds that had never mattered to the Council's core structure. It didn't radiate from a center. It spread. Like roots. Every node linked to another through layers of ownership structures, indirect partnerships, and independent agreements that, when examined individually, appeared mundane, legal, unremarkable. But taken together, they revealed something far more significant. A network. Complete. Operational. And entirely outside Council control. No official declaration had ever announced it. No formal charter had been presented. No diplomatic recognition had been requested. It had simply grown. Quietly. Patiently. For years. "Show me the origin point," the official beside her said, his voice low, controlled. Lena hesitated. Because there wasn't one. Not a single center. Not a capital. Not a command node. Instead, there were dozens of primary hubs, each capable of operating independently, each connected to multiple others, each reinforcing the stability of the whole without relying on any singular point of failure. Decentralized. Resilient. Untraceable in the ways the Council understood control. They didn't build a replacement system, Lena said slowly, the realization settling into words as she spoke them. They built something that doesn't need one. The room fell silent. Because that changed everything. This wasn't competition. It wasn't opposition. It was evolution. The Council's infrastructure had always been hierarchical, structured around authority, oversight, control. Every system fed into another. Every decision passed through layers of governance designed to maintain balance. Humanity had built something else entirely. A system that didn't require permission. Didn't require centralization. Didn't require the Council at all. And it was working. Better than anything that had come before it. A new data stream appeared on the central display, live trade metrics from one of the outer nodes. Efficiency, 99.98%. Delay variance, negligible. Conflict arbitration, resolved locally, instantly. No backlog. No friction. No need for intervention. Lena felt a quiet, almost reluctant sense of awe settle over her. They hadn't just replaced what was lost. They had removed the need for it. "Why hasn't it been revealed?" someone asked from across the room, the question cutting through the silence. It was the only question that mattered now. Because if this network existed, if it had been operating this efficiently for years, then humanity had every reason to make it known. To claim it. To leverage it. But they hadn't. They had stayed silent. Hidden. Watching. Lena zoomed out on the map, her eyes tracing the pattern again, not just the connections, but the placement. Outer systems. Ignored regions. Species the Council had categorized as low priority, low influence, low value. And suddenly, the answer didn't feel like a mystery anymore. It felt like a decision. "They weren't building it for us," she said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Because if that was true, then the Council hadn't just removed humanity from its system. It had removed itself from humanity's future. A priority alert cut through the moment. Multiple core systems reporting critical strain. Not failure yet, but close. Closer than anything before. The projections updated in real time, recalculating survival thresholds, resource depletion rates, system recovery probabilities. None of them looked good. The room shifted, focus snapping back to the present, to the problem that could no longer be ignored. The network wasn't just an alternative anymore. It was the only viable solution. And for the first time since the silence began, the Council faced a reality it had never prepared for. They weren't in control. They weren't even necessary. And if they wanted access, they were going to have to ask. The request draft appeared on the central console. No one moved to send it. Because one question remained, unspoken but impossible to ignore. After everything that had happened, why would humanity say yes? The crisis didn't announce itself with a single catastrophic failure. It unfolded the way all real collapses do, quietly at first, then all at once. A mid-core energy redistribution grid began drifting out of phase, its balancing algorithms lagging just enough to create uneven load distribution across 3 adjacent systems. Normally, the correction protocols would have compensated instantly. This time, they didn't. The imbalance triggered a chain reaction, minor at the start, manageable on its own, but the delays stacked. Each correction arrived just a fraction too late, forcing the next system to compensate harder, faster, less efficiently. Within hours, what should have been a routine adjustment became a cascade. Power fluctuations spread across entire sectors. Shield networks dipped below safety thresholds. Orbital stations initiated emergency conservation measures. Civilian traffic was rerouted, then stalled entirely as navigation systems struggled to synchronize under inconsistent conditions. And still, nothing actually broke. That was what made it worse. Everything hovered at the edge. Functional, but unstable. Operational, but unreliable. The Council's emergency response divisions mobilized immediately. Containment protocols were deployed, auxiliary systems activated, manual overrides engaged across hundreds of nodes. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like they might stabilize it. Then the second cascade began. A logistics bottleneck formed in the outer trade lanes, triggered by delayed routing corrections that had accumulated unnoticed. Cargo vessels began queuing in patterns the system couldn't resolve fast enough. Supply chains tightened. Critical shipments stalled in transit, waiting for pathways that no longer aligned with real-time conditions. Medical distribution schedules slipped. Agricultural imports missed their synchronization windows. And beneath it all, the infrastructure kept catching, stuttering, failing to align with itself. The projections updated every 6 minutes. Each update worse than the last. Time to critical failure. Narrowing. 17 days. Then 14. Then 11. The room Lena stood in no longer felt like a place of analysis. It felt like a countdown. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. This wasn't a system that could be repaired from within. It was a system that had already moved beyond their ability to control. They're not accelerating it, Lena said, her voice cutting through the overlapping streams of data and urgent conversations. They're letting it run. The official beside her looked at her sharply. Letting it run. She nodded, eyes fixed on the projections. All the previous disruptions, those were controlled, measured, designed to avoid collapse. She paused, the implication settling into place even as she spoke it. This isn't being controlled anymore. Why? Lena didn't answer immediately. Because she already knew. Because the pattern had changed in a way that left only one possible conclusion. They don't need to control it anymore. Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because that meant something else had reached completion. The network. A transmission alert interrupted the moment. Priority clearance, external origin. Not from within the Council. Not from any registered system. Unknown. The room froze. For a second, just a second, no one moved. Then the official gestured sharply. Open it. The display shifted, replacing cascading failure metrics with a clean, minimal interface. No insignia. No formal identification. Just a single line of text. External routing capacity available. No demand. No condition. No explanation. Lena felt her pulse steady, not from relief, but from recognition. They're offering it, someone said, disbelief threading through their voice. No, Lena said quietly. They're showing it exists. Because there was a difference. A critical one. The message didn't ask for acknowledgement. Didn't request negotiation. Didn't even confirm ownership. It simply presented a fact. Capacity was there. Whether the Council could access it was another matter entirely. Trace it, the official ordered. The system complied. And failed. There was no origin point. No transmission pathway. No identifiable source. The message hadn't come through the network. It had appeared alongside it. As if it had always had a place there. As if it belonged. Lena stepped closer to the display, her mind racing through possibilities that no longer felt theoretical. "They've integrated it already," she said. "Integrated what?" the official demanded. She turned to him, the full weight of the realization settling into her expression. "Their system. Not as an addition. Not as an overlay. But as something running parallel, invisible until now. Waiting." The projections updated again. 9 days. Then 7. The decline wasn't slowing. It wasn't stabilizing. It was converging. Every failing system, every disrupted pathway, every misaligned process, they all pointed toward the same narrowing outcome. A single point of failure. A moment where the existing infrastructure would no longer sustain itself. And when that moment came, there would only be one system left that could. The official stared at the message on the screen, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the truth he hadn't wanted to face. "We have to respond." Lena didn't argue. Because this was no longer about pride. Or control. Or even authority. It was about survival. The request protocol was drafted in under 3 minutes. Formal. Structured. Carefully worded to maintain dignity without assuming leverage. It asked for access. For temporary routing support. For emergency integration under crisis conditions. It was everything the Council had never imagined it would need to ask. The room held its breath as the final authorization was entered. The message sent. And for the first time since the silence began, they waited. Not for failure. Not for escalation. But for an answer. The response didn't come immediately. It came 6 hours later. And when it did, it wasn't what anyone expected. The reply arrived without ceremony. No signature. No insignia. No traceable origin. Just a structured packet, clean, precise, and unmistakably intentional. It wasn't a message. It was a process. Lena watched as the system parsed it automatically, unfolding layers of procedural language that felt eerily familiar. Not copied. Not replicated. Recognized. Step sequences. Verification protocols. Arbitration conditions. Frameworks the Council itself had used for decades, optimized, refined, and returned in a form that was sharper, faster, and stripped of everything unnecessary. "They're not negotiating," Lena said quietly. The official beside her didn't look away from the screen. "Then what is this?" She exhaled slowly. "They're onboarding us." The distinction settled heavily across the room. Because onboarding implied something fundamental. Not equals. Participants. The packet outlined access conditions. Clear, neutral, and absolute. Emergency routing capacity would be granted under predefined operational constraints. Data exchange would follow network standard protocols. Verification checkpoints would ensure system integrity. No mention of authority. No recognition of hierarchy. No concession to the Council's previous position. It didn't ask who they were. Only how they would comply. A silence followed that felt different from all the others that had come before it. Not uncertainty. Not fear. Recognition. The Council, the same body that had defined interstellar governance for generations, was being asked to operate under someone else's system. And there was no alternative. "How long?" the official asked, his voice quieter now. Lena didn't need to check the projections again. 6 days, she said. That was the edge. Beyond that, the models stopped providing recovery scenarios. The official straightened slightly, a reflex more than a decision. "Then we proceed." There was no vote. No debate. No formal resolution. The framework was accepted. Not unanimously, but decisively. The integration began immediately. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The systems continued their slow, uneven decline. Delays persisted. Routing inefficiencies compounded. The familiar friction of a failing infrastructure remained firmly in place. Then, a shift. Small. Almost imperceptible. A single trade lane stabilized. Not gradually. Instantly. The system corrected itself with a precision no one had seen since before the exile. Routing paths realigned. Traffic flow normalized. Predictive models recalibrated in real time. No intervention required. No oversight requested. It simply worked. Another lane followed. Then another. Not everywhere. Not all at once. Selective. Targeted. Each correction occurring exactly where the system needed it most, and nowhere else. They're controlling the entry points, Lena said, her eyes tracking the changes as they spread. Why not stabilize everything? Someone asked, unable to hide the tension in their voice. Lena didn't answer immediately. Because the pattern was already forming. Because the answer was already there. They don't need to. The realization settled like weight across the room. The network wasn't replacing the system all at once. It was absorbing it. Piece by piece. Only the parts that connected. Only the parts that aligned. Everything else. Left behind. The projections updated again. 5 days. But for the first time, the number didn't carry the same finality. Because alongside the failing systems, a second set of metrics had appeared. Stability indices. Rising. Fast. The more the council integrated, the more those numbers climbed. And the more they climbed, the less the old system mattered. A new alert triggered. Priority level absolute. Not a failure. A threshold. Lena turned back to the central display as the data resolved into something none of them had expected to see so soon. A convergence point. Not theoretical. Active. The network wasn't just stabilizing sectors. It was linking them. Creating continuous pathways that bypassed the council's infrastructure entirely. Trade routes that no longer required central routing hubs. Communication lines that didn't pass through official relays. Logistics chains that operated independently of established systems. The integration wasn't support. It was transition. The official took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the expanding network map. When does it stop? He asked. Lena's answer came without hesitation. It doesn't. Because that was the final piece. The part none of them had fully understood until now. This wasn't a temporary solution. It wasn't a recovery. It wasn't even a takeover. It was something far more absolute. The network didn't need permission to grow. It didn't need approval to expand. It didn't recognize boundaries the council had spent centuries enforcing. It simply connected what it could, optimized what it touched, and moved forward. Another system stabilized. Then another. The old infrastructure still existed, but it was no longer central. No longer necessary. Just there. Fading. The official lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of realization settling into something quieter than defeat. We built a system, he said slowly, that required us to be at the center of it. Lena didn't look away from the display. They built one that doesn't require anyone to be. The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't uncertainty. It was understanding. Because for the first time since the silence began, the shape of the future was no longer a question. It was already unfolding in front of them. And they were no longer the ones deciding what it would look like. The final integration prompt appeared on the central console. Authorization required. Full transition access. No rollback. The official stared at it for a long moment. Then, without looking at anyone else, he reached forward. And accepted. The moment the authorization completed, nothing happened. No surge of light. No system-wide alert. No declaration marking the transition. Just silence. For a fraction of a second, it almost felt like failure. Like the system had simply done nothing. Then the numbers changed. Not gradually. Not progressively. Completely. Every metric across the central display recalibrated at once. Trade flow stabilized. Routing delays vanished. Communication latency dropped to near zero. Energy distribution aligned across sectors that had been hours away from critical imbalance. The projections didn't update. They disappeared. Because there was nothing left to predict. The system wasn't compensating anymore. It was stable. Perfectly. Lena stood motionless, watching the data settle into a state she had only ever seen in simulations, Ideal efficiency without fluctuation, without correction cycles, without the constant background noise of systems trying to fix themselves. It wasn't just better. It was effortless. How much of it is us? Someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Lena didn't answer immediately. Because the display was still shifting, not in performance, but in structure. The old network was still there. Visible. Active. But no longer central. The pathways that had once defined interstellar movement, trade lanes, relay junctions, arbitration hubs, had been rerouted, bypassed, or quietly integrated into something larger. Something that didn't need them to function. She accessed a deeper layer of the system, tracing the active routes, the data flows, the infrastructure links now carrying the weight of an entire civilization. What she found wasn't a replacement. It was a redefinition. The Council's systems had become optional. Fallback layers. Legacy support. The real network, the one now carrying everything that mattered, operated independently. Fluid. Decentralized. Alive in a way the old system had never been. Not much, Lena said finally. The words weren't bitter. They weren't even surprised. Just accurate. A quiet realization spread through the room, settling into something that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite acceptance. Something in between. Because the system hadn't rejected them. It hadn't removed them. It had simply moved forward without needing them at the center. A new message appeared on the display. No alert. No priority flag. Just a standard transmission, formatted with the same clean precision as everything else in the network. Acknowledgement of integration. Confirmation of access. Operational guidelines attached. Lena opened the file. It was concise, clear, and entirely impersonal. No reference to the past. No mention of the exile. No indication that any of this had ever been conflict. Just process. The official beside her read over her shoulder, his expression unreadable as he reached the final line. Is that it? He asked. Lena scrolled back to the top, scanning for something, anything, that might carry meaning beyond the procedural. There was nothing. No statement. No message. No victory. Just the work. She closed the file slowly. That's it. The answer lingered in the air, heavier than any accusation could have been. Because this wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even acknowledgement. Humanity hadn't responded to the exile. Hadn't argued against it. Hadn't tried to reclaim what was taken. They had simply built something else. Something larger. Something better. And when the moment came, they didn't use it to dominate. They used it to continue. The display shifted again, pulling up a live view of the outer systems. The network extended far beyond the Council's former reach now, threading through regions that had never been mapped, connecting worlds that had never been counted. Ships moved along routes that hadn't existed weeks ago. Data flowed through pathways no one had authorized. Entire sectors operated in quiet synchronization, untouched by the instability that had once threatened everything. It was already expanding. Still, Lena watched the movement, the scale of it, the quiet inevitability of what came next, and felt something settle into place, not fear, not regret. Understanding. They didn't wait for us to fail, she said softly. The official glanced at her. Then what did they wait for? Lena's gaze remained fixed on the network, on the steady, unstoppable growth of something that had never asked for permission to exist. For us to realize we were never required. Silence followed. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. Outside the chamber, the galaxy continued as it always had, ships moving, systems running, civilizations adapting. But beneath it all, something fundamental had changed. Not suddenly. Not violently. Quietly. Completely. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the Council's old authority, the network continued to grow, connecting, stabilizing, expanding, not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as something that had never needed it in the first place. There was no announcement. No declaration of a new order. Just a simple, undeniable truth, written not in words, but in the way the galaxy now moved. Humanity hadn't reclaimed its place. It had outgrown it.